Right now, as you're driving your car and listening to this, you are actually performing a biological miracle. I mean, one that completely defies the capabilities of, like, our most advanced artificial intelligence.
Oh, absolutely. We take it completely for granted.
We really do, because, your eyes are scanning the asphalt, your hands are making these uh, microscopic torque adjustments to the steering wheel, your foot is hovering perfectly over the brake pedal.
Right, applying exactly enough pressure to maintain speed, but, without actually engaging the brake pads.
Exactly. And you aren't consciously calculating the geometry or the muscle tension or the Newtonian physics required for any of it. It just flows.
It feels instantaneous, right?
Totally.
But underneath that smooth automatic experience is this incredibly dense, intricately layered computational symphony.
Which is exactly what we're going to unpack today. Welcome back to our ongoing deep dive into the neuroscience of movement. We're taking our time with this, really breaking down the mechanics because, well, we know you're probably commuting or driving right now, so we're going to keep the pace deliberate.
Yeah, no need to rush. The brain certainly doesn't rush this stuff well. It does it fast, but it's a very deliberate process.
Right. So just a quick recap of where we've been. In the first part of this deep dive, we established that voluntary movement starts with this intention to act, and the parietal cortex acts as our internal GPS.
Providing the state estimation, yes. It tells us where our body is, where the objects are around us.
It draws the map. But as we know, a map doesn't actually drive the car.
No, it doesn't.
So today, our mission is to cross the bridge from that estimation to actual physical action. We're moving into the frontal lobe to explore exactly how the premotor cortex selects and plans a movement and how the primary motor cortex ultimately, pulls the trigger.
I love that framing, because it really is a journey from abstract rules and potentials down to concrete physics. We're translating a thought into a highly coordinated symphony of muscle contractions.
And it's a hierarchy, right? We're starting at the very top.
We are. Before a single muscle twitches, the brain has to decide what to do. And that decision is always a negotiation between internal desires like, I'm thirsty, I want water, and external realities.
Like, hey, there's a glass of water on the table.
Exactly. So let's start with a purely internal side. Where does a self-initiated action actually begin in the cortical hardware?
Right, the internal spark. Where do we look for that?
We look toward the medial wall of the frontal hemisphere. So if you imagine slicing the brain down the middle and looking at the inner surface of one of the hemispheres, you find a region called the supplementary motor area, or SMA.
Okay, the SMA.
And just anterior to it, so just in front of it, is the pre-supplementary motor area, the pre-SMA.
And together they make up the supplementary motor complex, right?
You got it. And this region is the absolute epicenter for self-initiated, internally driven movements.
So to clarify for everyone listening, this is less about reacting to a baseball suddenly flying at your face and more about just sitting on the couch and spontaneously deciding, you know what? It's time to get up and make dinner.
That is the crucial distinction.
Yeah.
Yes. The SMA is dealing with internal drives. And the electrophysiological evidence for this is just staggering.
You're talking about the EEG studies, right? The readiness potential.
Yes, exactly. In the 1960s, researchers like Hans Kornhuber and Luder-Dieck, they started placing these EEG electrodes on the scalps of human subjects. And they gave them a simple instruction: just flex your finger.
Okay, sounds easy enough.
But the catch was they had to do it completely spontaneously. There was no countdown, no visual cue, just whenever you feel the internal urge to move, flex the finger.
Which, as a researcher, sounds like a nightmare to study. Because how do you measure a completely spontaneous thought? You have no idea when the trigger's going to happen.
Right. You can't predict it. So you have to look backward in time.
Wait, look backward. How does that work?
They recorded continuous brain activity. And every time the subject moved their finger, the researchers marked that exact millisecond as time 0.
Okay, got it.
Then they took hundreds of these trials, aligned them all at that time 0 mark, and averaged the brain waves going backward in time from the movement.
Because when you average hundreds of trials, the random background noise of the brain just kind of cancels itself out, right?
Exactly. The noise disappears and the underlying signal emerges. And what they found was this slow, building negative electrical shift concentrated right over that medial frontal cortex.
Over the SMA?
Yes. They called it the Bereitschaftspotential, which translates from German as the readiness potential.
So what is the timeline here? Because I remember this being mind-blowing when I first read about it. When does that electrical wave actually start building up relative to the finger moving at time 0?
It begins to rise roughly 0.8 to a full 1 second before the muscle even twitches. And in some variations of the experiment where the movement was more complex, The SMA begins firing up to 2 seconds prior to the movement.
I really want to pause and let that sink in for a second,
Yeah.
because if you're driving right now, think about this. In neuroscience terms, a full second is an absolute eternity.
It's an age.
Yeah. I mean, the visual cortex processes a complex image in just a few hundred milliseconds. But you're saying the brain is visibly revving its engines, allocating resources, and committing to a physical action a full second before the person actually moves.
It's incredible, isn't it? But the implications go even deeper than just metabolic prep.
Right, because this leads into Benjamin Libet's work in the 80s, doesn't it?
It does. Libet added another variable that really threw a wrench into the philosophy of free will. He had subjects watch a rapidly rotating clock face, and he asked them to note the exact position of the clock hand the moment they became consciously aware of the urge to move.
Okay, so we have 3 data points now. The brainwave, the conscious urge, and the physical movement.
Exactly. And the sequence goes like this. The readiness potential in the SMA starts building at -1 second.
Correct?
The subject reports the conscious urge to move at roughly -200 milliseconds, and then the movement happens at time 0.
Wait. So if the SMA is firing a full second before the movement, but the conscious mind only realizes it wants to move a fifth of a second before the movement,
You see the problem.
the brain is initiating the action before the person even knows they want to do it. The physical machinery of the brain is deciding to move before the conscious eye gets the memo.
It creates a profound philosophical dilemma regarding free will. The motor plan is already being assembled in the supplementary motor complex before your conscious mind ever takes ownership of the intention.
So are we just passengers in our own bodies?
Well, Libet argued that we might not be completely helpless, because there is still that 200 millisecond gap between the conscious urge and the actual movement. He suggested the conscious mind acts as a veto.
A veto, I like that.
Right. We might not have free will to initiate the movement, but we have free won't. We have the ability to cancel the SMA's plan at the last possible fraction of a second.
Free won't. That totally reframes the entire concept of self-control. It's
Yeah.
like the SMA is just constantly bubbling up these internal motor plans, throwing spaghetti at the wall, and consciousness is just a gateway filtering which ones get to proceed.
That's a great way to put it.
So mechanically speaking, if the SMA is the source of this internal drive, this bubbling, what happens when it breaks? Like if a patient suffers a stroke in the medial frontal wall, I imagine that internal bubbling just stops.
Sadly, yes. Clinically, severe damage to the SMA and pre-SMA results in a profound deficit called akinesia.
Akinesia, which means the inability to initiate movement, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what makes this so striking for a neurologist is that it is not paralysis.
Really?
Yeah, the primary motor cortex is intact. The spinal cord is fine. The muscles are perfectly healthy. If you test their reflexes, they work perfectly.
So the hardware is there.
The hardware is completely functional. But the patient might lie in bed for hours, completely motionless. The internal spark, that self-driven translation of desire into action, is simply gone.
That is terrifying.
It is. And if the lesion affects the facial and vocal musculature, the patient exhibits mutism. They possess all the physical hardware for speech, but they lack the internal initiator to run the software.
Okay, so that covers the initiation side of the SMA. But going back to that concept of the veto, of filtering actions, the literature we're reading emphasizes that the medial premotor areas are just as critical for stopping behaviors as they are for starting them.
Absolutely. The SMA is fundamentally involved in contextual control. It doesn't just initiate. It heavily suppresses actions that might be triggered by the environment, but are entirely inappropriate for the current social or behavioral context.
Right.
And when you lose this inhibitory control, the clinical manifestations are incredibly bizarre. It really highlights how much of our brain is just silently waiting to interact with the world if left unchecked.
Yes. I want to talk about utilization behavior because reading Francois Lermite's original case studies on this absolutely blew my mind. Walk us through what happens when a patient loses that SMA suppression.
Lermite was a brilliant French neurologist, and he observed patients with extensive frontal lobe lesions. In utilization behavior, a patient essentially becomes a slave to the affordances of their environment.
What do you mean by affordances?
Well, remember how the parietal cortex sees an object, calculates its geometry, and automatically prepares the motor plan to interact with it?
Right, it sees a coffee mug and primes the hand to grab the handle.
Exactly. Normally, your SMA says, "We don't need coffee right now, it's not ours," and suppresses the plan. But without the SMA, the sight of the object forces the execution of the movement.
So if a patient walks into a doctor's office and there's a pair of glasses sitting on the desk,
The patient will simply reach out, pick up the glasses, and put them on their face,
Even if they don't need glasses.
even if they're already wearing a pair of glasses.
Oh.
Yeah, if Lermity placed a third pair on the desk, the patient would pick those up and put them on too. If there's a pitcher of water in a glass, they will pour the water and drink it, even if they aren't thirsty at all.
The object itself is commanding the behavior.
Precisely. The visual stimulus triggers the ingrained motor program, and without the medial frontal cortex to assert contextual rules, the brain just runs the script automatically.
It really strips away the illusion that we're always making these deliberate choices. I mean, it sounds like we're basically organic state machines, and the SMA is just the parking brake keeping us from rolling down the hill every time gravity, or in this case, a visual cue, pulls on us.
That's a perfect analogy. And the most extreme version of this failure of suppression is alien hand syndrome.
Oh, I've heard of this. This is where the hand seems to have a mind of its own.
Exactly. This often occurs when there is a lesion specifically affecting the SMA on one side of the brain, sometimes along with damage to the corpus callosum. A patient's hand will begin performing complex, goal-directed actions completely against their conscious will.
Like what kind of action?
Well, the hand might reach out and grab the steering wheel while they're driving, or it might unbutton their shirt as fast as their other hand is trying to button it up.
That sounds like a horror movie.
It's highly distressing for the patient. But neurologically, it makes sense. The parietal cortex is generating motor plans based on the environment, and the affected SMA can no longer inhibit them. The hand is essentially reacting to the world autonomously.
Wow. Okay, so the SMA is the internal initiator and the ultimate context enforcer. But let's look at how it actually structures an action. Like, if I decide to make a cup of coffee, that isn't one movement. It's a massive sequence.
Right, it's a series of events.
I have to grab the mug, open the jar, scoop the coffee, pour the water. Does the SMA handle that overarching timeline?
It does. And the way it encodes sequences really reveals the sheer abstraction of the frontal lobe. Researchers trained monkeys to perform complex sequences of movements to get a reward. Let's say the sequence is push a lever, then turn a dial, then pull a handle.
Push, turn, pull.
Got it. When they recorded from individual neurons in the SMA, they found cells that were highly specific to the order of operations.
Meaning a neuron wouldn't just fire every time the monkey's arm physically pushed the lever?
Exactly. The neuron would fire intensely when the monkey was preparing to push, but only if push was the first step in that specific push-turn-pull sequence.
Wait, really? So if you change the sequence...
If you change the sequence so that the monkey had to turn, then push, then pull, that exact same neuron would be completely silent during the push phase.
That is wild.
It doesn't care about the physical kinematics of extending the arm. It cares about the grammatical syntax of the behavior. It is encoding the macro architecture of the strategy.
It's like a project manager organizing a timeline, not the worker actually lifting the boxes.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so if the SMA is essentially a closed-loop system acting on internal desires and overarching strategies, how does a purely internal thought suddenly negotiate with a physical object in front of me? Like, if I'm driving and a light turns red, my internal desire to keep moving forward is instantly overridden by an external cue.
Right, you have to react.
There has to be a translator between the internal strategy and the sensory reality of the world.
And to find that translator, we have to move outward from the medial wall to the lateral surface of the brain.
Okay.
Shifting outward.
This is where we locate the dorsal premotor cortex, the PMD, and the ventral premotor cortex, the PMV. If the SMA is the strategist dealing with internal drives, the lateral premotor cortex is the tactician.
The tactician.
Yes, its entire job is to prepare and shape motor actions that are directly guided by external sensory information.
Okay, let's break those down, starting with the PMD, the dorsal area. What is its specific tactical domain? The PMD is heavily specialized for reaching movements in space, particularly when those movements depend on external cues or arbitrary rules. And to really understand the PMD, we have to look at how neuroscientists figured out how to separate the thinking about a movement from the actual doing of a movement.
Which is hard because they happen almost simultaneously, right?
Exactly, because if you just hold out a piece of fruit to a monkey and it immediately reaches for it, all the brain areas fire at once. Visual cortex, premotor, primary motor, they all light up simultaneously. You can't tell who is planning and who is executing.
So you have to force the brain into a holding pattern. You have to somehow create a gap between the instruction and the execution.
Precisely. And we do this using what are called delayed instruction or delayed response tasks.
How does that work?
A monkey is seated in front of a screen while researchers record from single neurons in the PMD. A visual cue appears, say, a red target lights up on the right side of the screen. This is the instruction. It tells the monkey where it will eventually need to reach, but the monkey is trained not to move yet. It has to wait for a second cue, the go signal.
Okay, so during that delay period when the monkey is just sitting perfectly still, not moving a muscle, what happens in the PMD?
The neurons in the PMD related to reaching rightward begin firing vigorously, and they maintain a high, sustained rate of activity throughout the entire delay.
Even though there's no movement.
Zero muscle movement.
Yeah.
But the brain is aggressively holding the motor plan in a state of high readiness. It's basically a form of motor working memory. The PMD is saying, I have the coordinates, I have the plan, I am just waiting for authorization.
And then the go signal comes.
The moment the go signal appears, the primary motor cortex engages, the arm moves, and the PMD neurons immediately drop back to baseline. Their tactical job is done.
That's fascinating. But, the environment isn't always that clear-cut. Usually we are faced with multiple options.
Right.
Like if I'm a tennis player waiting for a serve, I don't know if the ball is going to my forehand or my backhand. I have to prepare for both simultaneously until the ball actually leaves the server's racket.
Can the PMD hold multiple plans at once?
It excels at holding multiple plans. Paul Sisek and his colleagues ran some really elegant variations of this delay task. They would show the monkey two spatial cues simultaneously, one on the left, one on the right.
Okay.
During the delay period, the PMD doesn't just average the two and point to the middle. It actively prepares both distinct motor plans.
Seriously?
Yeah. If you look at the neural population, you see one cluster of neurons revving up the reach left plan and a totally separate cluster revving up the reach right plan. The brain is literally loading two different bullets into the chamber, hedging its bets.
And then when the final cue reveals the actual target.
Let's say a color cue indicates the correct target is the left one. Instantly, the neural population preparing the rightward reach is actively suppressed and silenced, while the population for the leftward reach spikes and drives the action.
So the PMD constantly builds a landscape of potential actions based on the environment and then selectively commits to one based on the rules of the task.
You mentioned rules. Applying arbitrary rules to movement is, arguably the foundation of modern human civilization.
It really is.
Like, I see a red octagon on a metal pole and I move my foot to the brake pedal. There is absolutely no natural, evolutionary, or geometric connection between a red sign and the physical act of extending a human leg. It's a purely semantic, learned rule. Is the PMD responsible for that associative leap?
Yes, the PMD is the core hub for conditional motor learning. It links arbitrary sensory stimuli to specific motor outputs. In a lab, you can train a monkey with complex conditional rules.
Give me an example.
Okay, for example, you show them a pattern on a screen. If the background behind the pattern is blue, the rule is move a joystick toward the pattern. If the background is yellow, the rule is move the joystick away from the pattern.
So the visual object is identical, but the background color completely changes the physical action required.
Exactly. And you will find neurons in the PMD that encode the rule itself, completely independently of the physical kinematics. A neuron might fire intensely whenever the rule move toward is active, regardless of whether the pattern happens to be on the left, right, up, or down.
It's abstracting the rule.
Yes, the PMD is applying logical if-then conditions to motor outputs. It is the neurological substrate for reading a musical score or typing on a keyboard or stopping at a red light.
Incredible. Okay, so the PMD handles the arm trajectory, the reaching, the spatial targeting, and the if-then rules. But reaching is only half the battle, right? Once my arm gets to the coffee mug, my hand actually has to interact with it.
Right, you have to grasp it.
And grabbing a steering wheel is a completely different physical mechanism than picking up a single key. Where does the shaping of the hand happen?
For that, we shift slightly downward, moving ventrally into the ventral premotor cortex, or PMV. Yes. The PMV has massive, dense anatomical connections with a very specific region in the parietal lobe called the anterior intraparietal area, or AIP. If you recall from the first part of our deep dive, the AIP is the area that analyzes the 3D geometry of an object and extracts its affordances.
Right, right. The concept pioneered by James Gibson. The visual cortex sees the shape of a mug, but the parietal cortex calculates that the handle affords a precision pincer grip while the main cylinder of the mug affords a whole hand power grip.
You got it. The parietal lobe computes those geometric possibilities, but it is the PMV that receives that data and translates it into a specific motor vocabulary for the hand.
A motor vocabulary.
Yeah, the PMV basically contains a library of grip types.
Hmm.
If you record from PMV neurons, you find extraordinary specificity. One neuron will fire exclusively when the monkey prepares to use a precision grip, like bringing the tips of the thumb and index finger together to pick up a raisin.
Okay.
That exact same neuron will remain entirely silent if the monkey prepares to use a power grip to grab a thick metal bar.
So the PMV is actively molding the hand to match the physics of the target object before the hand even gets there.
Exactly.
But the PMV isn't just a mindless shape-matching machine. There's a study in the source material, the Vibrotactile Discrimination Task by Rinaldo Romo. It suggests the PMV is deeply involved in higher-order perception. How does a motor area end up making perceptual decisions?
Oh, Romo's vibrotactile studies are among the most elegant experiments in modern neuroscience. They perfectly illustrate how the line between sensing the world and acting upon it is essentially arbitrary.
Set the stage for us. What did Romo do?
They trained monkeys to discriminate between two mechanical vibrations applied to their fingertips. The monkey feels a brief vibration, let's call it frequency 1, say it's 20 hertz. Then there's a brief pause, silent period.
Okay.
Then they feel the second vibration frequency, 2, say 30 hertz. The monkey has to decide, was the second frequency higher or lower than the first? And they indicate their choice by pressing one of two buttons.
Okay, on the surface, that sounds like a purely somatosensory problem. Like the skin feels the vibration, the sensory cortex registers the frequency, and the math happens somewhere in a cognitive area. Why would you even look in the PMV for that?
Because the entire purpose of perception is to guide action. When they mapped the neural activity through the cortex, they found that the primary somatosensory cortex S1 acted just like a microphone.
Meaning what?
Its neurons fired in a perfect, phase-locked rhythm with a physical vibration. If the probe vibrated at 20 hertz, the S1 neurons fired 20 times a second. But during that silent gap between the two vibrations, S1 goes completely quiet. It has no memory.
Oh, so S1 drops the ball. It can't compare frequency 2 to frequency 1 because it already forgot frequency 1.
Exactly. It's just a live feed. So the signal has to move forward into the frontal lobe, entering the premotor areas. When you record from the PMV during the second vibration, the neurons are doing something breathtaking.
What are they doing?
They are not just firing to reflect the 30 hertz of the second stimulus. Their firing rate actually represents the mathematical difference between the two frequencies. They are actively performing the subtraction, frequency 2 minus frequency 1.
Wait, the motor cortex is doing math. It is taking a stored memory of a physical sensation, comparing it to a live sensation, and generating a decision variable.
Yes, the PMV neuron is encoding the actual decision of which frequency was higher, which is the exact signal needed to drive the physical action of pushing the correct button.
That is wild.
The premotor cortex doesn't just passively wait for the cognitive areas of the brain to hand down a decision. It is actively participating in the working memory and the perceptual discrimination process itself. Action and perception are deeply, inextricably intertwined at the cellular level.
That drastically changes how we view the frontal lobe. It's not just a physical output terminal, it's a cognitive processor. But if we're talking about the intersection of perception and action in the PMV, we absolutely have to discuss the most famous, most heavily debated neurons in all of neuroscience, the neurons that sparked 1,000 psychology textbooks.
Yes, you're referring to mirror neurons.
Mirror neurons.
Discovered by Giacomo Rizzolatti and his team at the University of Parma in the 1990s. They were recording from a specific subdivision of the PMV known as Area F5, which is an area packed with those grip-specific motor neurons we just discussed.
Right. So the researchers were mapping neurons that fire when a macaque monkey reaches out and grasps a piece of food, like a peanut, just a very standard motor mapping experiment. What was the serendipitous accident that completely upended their research?
Well, the monkey was sitting in the chair, wired up to the recording equipment, and the audio monitor was on, meaning every time an action potential fired in the monkey's F5 area, the speaker in the lab would emit a sharp popping sound.
Pop, pop, pop.
Right. During a break between trials, the monkey was completely motionless, just passively watching the room. One of the human researchers happened to reach out and grasp a piece of food from the tray, and suddenly the audio monitor erupted with the loud static popping of the monkey's motor neurons firing.
Wait, the monkey didn't move a single muscle. It just watched a human perform the exact action it had been doing, and its motor cortex fired as if it were the one grabbing the peanut.
Yes. It was a total paradigm shift.
Yeah.
They systematically tested these cells and found a population of neurons in F5 that fire both when the animal performs a specific goal-directed action and when it merely observes another individual performing that same specific action.
That is just, wow.
The visual perception of the act directly recruits the motor circuitry used to execute the act. They term them mirror neurons.
Okay, let me push back on this because this concept leaked out of neuroscience and into pop psychology very quickly, and I want to make sure we are grounding this in the actual neurobiology.
That's fair. There's been a lot of hype.
Right. Is my brain literally simulating your actions right now as I watch you move your hands while we talk? Is the boundary between doing and seeing really that blurred? Or is this just a quirk of macaque monkeys staring at peanuts in a lab?
It is not just a quirk. The functional imaging data in humans strongly supports the existence of an extensive mirror neuron system involving the premotor cortex and the inferior parietal lobule. The prevailing theory, known as the direct matching hypothesis, posits that we fundamentally understand the actions of others by mapping their visual representation onto our own internal motor system.
So when I watch you reach for your coffee mug,
the visual kinematics of my arm are fed into your parietal cortex, which then feeds into your PMD, subtly activating the exact neural circuits you would use to reach for that coffee. Your brain is running a covert, subthreshold, physical simulation of my behavior.
So I understand what you are doing because my body secretly imagines doing it, but does it understand why you are doing it? Like if I reach for a coffee cup to take a drink versus reaching for it to throw it in the sink, the physical movement of the hand is almost identical. Does the mirror neuron know the difference in intent?
That is where the system reveals its true sophistication. It's not just mapping raw kinematics. It is inferring goal and intent.
How do we know that?
Researchers tested this by having a monkey observe a human grasping a piece of food. The mirror neuron fired. Then the human performed the exact same grasping kinematics, but there was no food there. They just grabbed empty air.
And the neuron?
The mirror neuron remained completely silent. It only responds to a biologically meaningful, goal-directed interaction with an object. Furthermore, in the parietal areas of this mirror network, neurons will actually differentiate based on the ultimate goal.
Meaning?
A neuron will fire vigorously if you watch someone grasp a piece of food to eat it, but will fire significantly less if you watch them grasp the exact same piece of food just to place it in a container.
It's encoding the context of the future. The implications of that are staggering. If my motor system is actively resonating with your physical goals, this has to be the foundational hardware for observational learning. When a child watches a parent tie their shoes, their motor cortex is already running the simulation.
Observational learning, yes, absolutely. And many theorists argue it goes much deeper than that.
Like empathy.
Exactly. If we simulate actions, we likely simulate the emotional states linked to those actions. This direct matching mechanism has been proposed as the deeply rooted evolutionary foundation of empathy. We intuitively understand the joy or pain of another person because we physically mirror their facial expressions and postural states in our own neural architecture.
We feel what they feel because on a microscopic cellular level, we are doing what they are doing.
Yes.
We are wired at the level of our motor machinery to physically resonate with the humans around us. It is profoundly philosophical.
It really is.
Okay, let's take a breath and trace our path, because we've covered a lot of ground in the frontal lobe. We have the internal strategy generated in the SMA. We have the tactical reaching plan held in the PMD. We have the semantic rules applied. We have the hand shaped by the PMV to match the object's affordances.
Right.
So the frontal lobe has finalized the blueprint. Now, that massive, complex plan has to be handed down to the ultimate executioner to generate raw physical force. We have finally arrived at the primary motor cortex, or M1.
M1, Brodmann Area 4. Located immediately anterior to the central sulcus. This is the bottleneck.
The bottleneck.
All the abstract planning, the cognitive rules, the social context, it all has to be distilled down here into electrical impulses that will travel down the spinal cord and cause muscle fibers to physically contract.
Oh.
M1 translates neural information into mechanical physics.
When anyone takes an introductory psychology class, the very first thing they learn about the motor cortex is the map. The homunculus. The famous homunculus, yes. The idea that there is a little distorted human laid out across the surface of the brain. Let's dig into the history of how we mapped this territory, because it starts in a rather dark place with John Healings Jackson in the 19th century.
Yeah, Jackson was a brilliant English neurologist.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, his deep insights were largely driven by observing his own wife, who suffered from focal motor seizures.
Wow, that's tragic.
It was. And in the late 1800s, we had no brain imaging. The brain was a complete black box. But Jackson meticulously observed the physical manifestation of his wife's seizures. And he noticed a strict, unvarying pattern.
What kind of pattern?
The involuntary muscle spasms would always start in her fingers. Then the spasms would march up her wrist, up her forearm, into her shoulder, and finally involve her face.
The Jacksonian march. It wasn't random flailing. It was a highly organized progression of an electrical storm.
Exactly. And Jackson brilliantly deduced that the brain must contain a highly ordered topographical map of the body's musculature. The seizure was a localized electrical discharge that started in the finger area of the brain, and as the electricity physically spread across the cortical surface, it triggered the adjacent areas representing the arm, then the shoulder, then the face.
He hypothesized the map decades before we had the technology to prove it.
He did.
And the proof finally arrived in the mid-20th century, largely thanks to the pioneering and, frankly, intense surgical techniques of Wilder Penfield in Montreal.
Penfield really revolutionized neurosurgery. He was operating on patients with severe epilepsy, trying to locate and remove the precise tissue causing the seizures.
Right.
But to ensure he didn't accidentally remove brain tissue critical for movement or speech, he had to map the cortex of the individual patient before cutting. He did this using local anesthesia, meaning the patient's skull was open, the brain was exposed, but the patient was fully awake and conscious.
Which is possible because the brain itself has no pain receptors, right?
Correct. Penfield took a tiny electrical probe and systematically stimulated different points along the primary motor cortex. When he applied a tiny current to a specific spot near the top of the brain, the patient's contralateral leg would kick.
Just involuntarily.
Yeah. Moving down the side of the hemisphere, he hit a spot that caused the thumb to twitch. Further down, the lips would pucker. By systematically stimulating and observing, Penfield drew the somatotopic map, creating the visual icon we call the motor homunculus.
And the defining feature of the homunculus is that it looks like a monster.
It's very disproportionate.
Yeah, it has gargantuan oversized hands, a massive face, enormous lips and tongue, but a tiny, spindly little torso and legs. Why does the brain warp the proportions so severely?
Because cortical real estate is not allocated based on the physical volume or mass of the body part. The brain doesn't care that your thigh muscle is massive. The map is allocated based on the complexity, precision, and degree of fine motor control required by that body part. Our hands possess dozens of tiny muscles required for tool use, writing, and manipulation. Our vocal apparatus requires staggeringly precise coordination of the tongue, lips, and larynx for speech.
So they need more processing power.
Therefore, they require vast amounts of computational processing power, occupying huge territories on the M1 map, while the trunk, which mostly just maintains posture, gets a tiny sliver of representation.
This all makes perfect intuitive sense, but I need to challenge a misconception here, because the way Penfield's map is usually taught, and the way I conceptualized it for years, is like a piano keyboard.
Ah, yes, the piano analogy.
Right, like one key on the cortex connects directly to one specific muscle in the arm. You press the middle C, the bicep flexes. You press D, the tricep flexes. But the modern literature makes it very clear that this piano analogy is fundamentally wrong. How is M1 actually organized?
It is absolutely not a one-to-one piano keyboard. And to his credit, Penfield himself warned against interpreting his map that rigidly. Yes, there is a broad macro topography, the leg is medial, the arm is in the middle, the face is lateral. But when modern neuroscientists use microelectrodes to map the M1 cortex at a cellular level, the neat, discrete borders completely vanish.
So what does it look like?
The representation of individual muscles is highly distributed, fractured, and extensively overlapping.
Walk me through the layout of the arm area, because the sources describe it as having a horseshoe organization, which sounds incredibly complex.
Let's focus on the arm territory in M1. Mark Schieber and others have demonstrated that the representations of the fingers are not neatly lined up next to each other like piano keys. Instead, the area controlling the distal muscles, the fine movements of the fingers and the wrist, forms a central core.
A core of finger neurons, okay.
Surrounding this core, forming a large outer ring or a horseshoe shape, are the neurons that control the proximal muscles, the large sweeping movements of the elbow and the shoulder.
So the neurons controlling the delicate finger movements are physically surrounded by and deeply intermingled with the neurons controlling the heavy shoulder movements.
Yes.
That completely destroys the neat linear map. Why on earth would the brain wire itself so messily? A piano keyboard seems so much more logical.
It seems logical to a computer scientist, maybe, but is terrible for biological kinematics. Think about the physical reality of moving through the world. If you reach out to grab a glass of water, you do not move your shoulder, stop, then move your elbow, stop, then open your fingers.
No, it's all one fluid motion.
Natural movement is fundamentally multi-joint. To successfully extend your hand forward, you have to dynamically stabilize your shoulder against gravity, smoothly extend your elbow, and pre-shape your wrist simultaneously. If M1 were a piano keyboard, the brain would have to simultaneously coordinate thousands of distant, disconnected keys.
Which would require massive, slow communication across the cortex.
Precisely. By highly overlapping the representations, putting the finger neurons right next to, and intertwined with the shoulder neurons, M1 allows for dense, rapid horizontal connections between these areas. A single neuron in M1 rarely projects to just one muscle. Its axon travels down the spinal cord, branches out, and synapses onto multiple different pools of motor neurons that control multiple different muscles spanning different joints. M1 does not encode single muscles, it encodes motor synergies. It groups muscles together into functional teams that naturally work together to achieve fluid, coordinated movements.
It's an operational map, not an anatomical one. It groups things by how they are used together, not where they live on the body.
That is perfectly stated.
But within this complex, overlapping map of synergies, there is a very specific anatomical pathway that gives humans our unique evolutionary edge. Let's talk about the direct line. Let's talk about the CM cells.
Corticomotor neuronal cells, or CM cells. These are a highly specialized subset of giant pyramidal neurons located in cortical layer 5 of M1 that fundamentally changed primate evolution.
Why are they so special?
To understand that, we have to look at how the neural signal normally travels from the brain to the muzzle. The vast majority of output from M1 travels down the long descending pathways of the spinal cord and terminates in the intermediate zone of the spinal gray matter, synapsing onto spinal interneurons.
These interneurons are the middlemen.
Yes. The interneurons act as local distribution hubs. M1 sends a broad command down to the interneuron, and the interneuron then distributes that command to several different alpha motor neurons, which are the final cells that actually drive the muscles.
Okay.
It is a distributed, hierarchical system, great for broad, coordinated movements like walking or reaching. But CM cells bypass the middleman entirely. The axon of a CM cell travels all the way from the cortex down the spinal cord and synapses monosynaptically directly with no intermediate stops onto the alpha motor neuron in the ventral horn.
I use an analogy to understand this hierarchy. The older, indirect pathways that use interneurons are like a high-level manager standing on a balcony overlooking a factory floor. The manager shouts general orders down to the floor supervisors, the interneurons. Hey, move that heavy pallet over there.
Right.
The supervisor then coordinates a team of 6 workers to lift the pallet. It's great for heavy lifting, but the manager can't control exactly where one worker places their foot. The CM cells, on the other hand, are like the CEO having a direct, highly encrypted, private earpiece into the ear of one specific worker's left hand.
That is a phenomenal analogy. CM cells provide a private line for unparalleled, precise, independent control. And the key is where these direct connections terminate. They almost exclusively target the motor neurons controlling the distal extremities, the forearm, the wrist, and critically the individual fingers.
This is the hardware for fractionated movement, the ability to move my index finger completely independently while keeping the rest of my hand perfectly still.
Exactly. And this direct CM pathway is a relatively recent evolutionary development. It is virtually absent in lower mammals. A cat or a dog has incredible agility and speed, relying heavily on those interneuron networks, but a cat cannot isolate its index finger and thumb to perform a precision pincer grasp to pick up a single crumb off the floor.
Right.
The CM system expanded massively in non-human primates and reached its absolute zenith in humans, granting us the astonishing distal dexterity required to play a Chopin nocturne, perform microsurgery, or type on a smartphone.
Okay, we have the map. We have the CM cells providing the direct wiring. But we haven't answered the most fundamental computational question. What is the actual language that these M1 neurons are speaking? When my M1 sends a signal down that direct wire, what exactly is the message? Is it a geometric command, like move the hand rightward by 10 centimeters? Or is it a mechanical command, like flex the bicep with 15 newtons of force?
This gets into the classic debate of kinematics versus kinetics.
Right, kinematics versus kinetics.
This was the defining debate of modern neuroscience in the mid-20th century. Kinematics refers to the spatial properties of movement, the direction, the velocity, the distance the hand travels through space. Kinetics refers to the underlying dynamic physical forces, the torque, the actual muscle tension required to move the mass of the arm against gravity.
Okay, so space versus force.
For a long time, the dominant theory was that the cortex handled the high-level math for spatial kinematics and left the dirty work of calculating muscle force to the spinal cord.
Because intuitively, when I want to pick up a cup, I just think about moving my hand to the spatial location of the cup. I don't consciously calculate the torque required by my deltoid.
Naturally.
But physical reality is demanding. Moving my hand upwards through empty air requires significantly less force than moving my hand upwards while holding a 20-pound dumbbell, even though the spatial trajectory, the kinematics, are exactly the same. How do we figure out which math M1 was doing?
The breakthrough came from Edward Everts at the NIH in the late 1960s. Everts was a pioneer. He developed a technique to record from single neurons in the brains of awake, behaving monkeys.
Okay, what was his experiment?
He designed a brilliantly elegant experiment to decouple kinematics from kinetics. He implanted a microelectrode into a single M1 neuron. He trained the monkey to perform a very simple, repetitive motion, grasping a handle and flexing its wrist inward to a specific spatial target.
So the kinematic movement, the angle and direction of the wrist bending, is rigidly identical every single time.
Exactly identical, but Everts attached the handle to a pulley system. On the other end of the pulley, hanging out of sight, he could secretly add or subtract weights.
Ah, sneaky.
In one trial, he would arrange the weight so it pulled against the monkey's hand. To make the wrist bend inward to the target, the monkey had to overcome the heavy resistance, requiring immense force from his flexor muscles.
A high kinetic demand for the exact same kinematic movement.
Then, on the next trial, he would flip the pulley. Now, the heavy weight was pulling in the direction of the movement. The monkey barely had to use its flexor muscles at all. It mostly just had to let the weight do the work and apply a tiny bit of extensor force to act as a brake so the handle wouldn't snap too fast.
So the physical movement through space was identical, but the force required was fundamentally different.
The ultimate control variable.
What did the M1 neuron trace look like on the oscilloscope?
The firing rate of the M1 neuron changed drastically depending on the load. When the weight resisted the movement, requiring high muscle force, the M1 neuron fired furiously, generating a massive barrage of action potentials. When the weight assisted the movement, requiring very little flexor force, the exact same neuron's firing dropped to almost nothing.
Even though the hand moved to the exact same place.
The neuron was not encoding the spatial direction of the hand. It was encoding the raw physical force required to generate the movement. Everts proved that M1 is intimately, inextricably involved in the low-level mechanical realities of muscle kinetics.
It is calculating the raw physics. But that leads to a huge problem, doesn't it?
A very big problem.
If M1 neurons are just force generators for specific muscles, how do we ever move in a straight line? If I want to reach for a target at exactly a 45-degree angle in 3D space, how does the brain coordinate all these individual force generators to produce a perfectly straight spatial trajectory?
To solve that, we moved to the 1980s and the monumental work of Apostolos Georgopoulos. He shifted the focus from simple wrist flexions to full, unconstrained 3D arm reaching.
Okay.
He trained monkeys to sit at a console and reach out to touch targets, arranged in a circle around a central starting point, sort of like numbers on a clock face. He recorded from individual M1 neurons as the monkey reached in all different directions.
And he found that neurons have a preference.
Yeah.
Right.
He found that single neurons in M1 possess a preferred direction. A specific neuron might fire at its absolute maximum rate when the monkey reaches up and to the right, say at exactly a 45-degree angle.
Okay, let me stop you right there. I want to push back heavily on the architecture of the system based on what we've established. You are saying a neuron prefers 45 degrees. If I want to reach at 45 degrees, that neuron fires.
Right.
But earlier, we established that M1 neurons branch out and connect to multiple different muscles across the shoulder and elbow. They are noisy, they are imprecise. Does that 45-degree neuron only fire when I move it exactly 45 degrees?
No, it does not. And that is the crux of the entire system. The neurons exhibit broad directional tuning, specifically what we call cosine tuning.
Cosine tuning?
Yeah. That neuron will fire at its absolute maximum rate at 45 degrees. But if the monkey reaches at 30 degrees, that same neuron will still fire quite a bit. If the monkey reaches at 60 degrees, it still fires. It will fire less at 90 degrees, and it will only be completely silent if the monkey reaches in the exact opposite direction at 225 degrees. Its tuning curve looks like a broad, sweeping bell curve.
But that is a terrible evolutionary design.
Why do you say that?
Think about it. If I want to precisely reach for a tiny target at 42 degrees, but my 45-degree neuron is firing, and my 30-degree neuron is firing, and my 60-degree neuron is firing, all sending noisy force commands to various overlapping shoulder and elbow muscles, how does my hand not just wobble and spasm uncontrollably? It sounds incredibly inefficient compared to just having one highly specific neuron for every exact angle. Why would the brain waste all that metabolic energy firing thousands of wrong neurons?
Because the brain prioritizes robustness over simple efficiency. It solves this massive imprecision through biological democracy. It uses a voting system.
A voting system.
Georgopoulos realized that you cannot understand the brain by looking at one neuron. No single neuron dictates the final movement. Instead, you have to look at the entire population of neurons firing simultaneously.
Walk us through the math of this population voting intuitively. How do thousands of wrong neurons create one right movement?
Imagine every single neuron in the M1 arm area is a person holding a tiny arrow. The arrow points in that neuron's preferred direction. When the command to move is given, every person holds up their arrow. But the length of their arrow depends on how fast they're firing in that exact moment.
Okay, so let's say the target is straight ahead, exactly at 90 degrees. The neuron whose preferred direction is 90 degrees is firing at absolute maximum speed, so its arrow is extremely long.
Correct, but the 80-degree neuron is also firing pretty fast, so it contributes a medium-length arrow pointing slightly right. The 100-degree neuron contributes a medium arrow pointing slightly left. The 45-degree neuron is barely firing, so it holds up a tiny arrow. The neurons pointing backward are silent, so they contribute nothing.
You have thousands of arrows pointing in a massive, messy spray of directions.
A neurological tug-of-war. To find the final movement, the brain essentially takes all those thousands of arrows, stacks them tip to tail in multidimensional space, and calculates the average. It draws one final massive arrow from the starting point to the end of the chain. This is vector addition. This final aggregated arrow is called the population vector.
And the trajectory of that final aggregated population vector
Points precisely, flawlessly, at the target. Georgopoulos proved that even though individual neurons are incredibly noisy, broadly tuned, and imprecise, when you aggregate the vectors of a large population, the noise cancels itself out perfectly. The resulting population vector predicts the exact spatial trajectory of the monkey's arm.
And returning to my challenge about efficiency, this is actually a far superior design because it degrades gracefully.
Precisely. Brain cells die every day. They misfire due to metabolic fluctuations. If you relied on a single, perfect 42-degree neuron to reach your coffee, and that neuron died, you'd be forever paralyzed in that specific direction. It would be a catastrophic failure. But in a population vector system, if 100 neurons die, the thousands of other neurons still voting easily drown out the missing data. The vector might shift by a fraction of a millimeter. It is a computationally brilliant, fault-tolerant system. It extracts exquisite precision from inherently imprecise biological hardware.
Okay, this is a monumental moment in the journey. The SMA generated the internal urge. The PMD selected the target and applied the rules. The PMB shaped the hand. M1 synthesized all of this, calculated the raw physical forces required, and utilized the democratic population vector to generate a massive, precise electrical command. The signal flies down the spinal cord, out the peripheral nerves, the muscles contract, and the arm reaches out. The brain's job is done, right?
Not even close.
I knew you were going to say that.
Because we are not moving in a vacuum. The real world is chaotic and unpredictable. What happens if, mid-reach, your elbow grazes the armrest of your chair? Or the coffee mug is heavier than you expected?
Right, the environment fights back.
The beautiful, mathematically perfect population vector that M1 just calculated is now completely wrong. The hand is physically knocked off course.
So M1 can't just be a commander that barks orders, covers its ears, and walks away. It has to stay on the line. It has to listen to feedback.
M1 is engaged in continuous, relentless, dynamic adaptation. It receives rapid, massive streams of sensory feedback from the periphery. The proprioceptors in your joints, the muscle spindles measuring stretch, the tactile receptors in your skin, they're all constantly streaming state updates back up to the brain.
And the speed of this feedback loop is staggering.
Oh, it's incredibly fast.
We are talking about reflexes, but I want to be clear for the listeners. We aren't talking about the simple spinal reflex like when the doctor taps your patellar tendon with a hammer and your knee jerks. That spinal loop is fast, maybe 20 to 30 milliseconds, but it doesn't involve the brain. We are talking about the brain's reflex.
Yes. We are talking about the long latency reflex, the transcortical loop. If your arm is bumped while reaching, the sensory signal of that error travels up the arm into the spinal cord, all the way up to the primary somatosensory cortex, S1.
Okay.
S1 then instantly forwards that error signal directly next door, across the central sulcus, into M1. M1 rapidly processes the error, calculates a new population vector to compensate, and blasts a corrective motor command back down the spinal cord to the muscles.
What is the transit time for that entire transcortical round trip?
Roughly 50 to 100 milliseconds.
50 milliseconds, a 20th of a second. The signal goes from the arm into the brain, gets mathematically processed by the motor cortex, and travels back down to physically flex the muscle, all before the conscious mind is even vaguely aware that the arm was bumped. It is a subconscious autopilot correcting your trajectory in real time.
It is an autopilot, but it is not a dumb, hardwired reflex. What truly separates the transcortical loop from a simple spinal reflex is that the brain's reflex is context-dependent. It changes based on your overarching behavioral goals.
How so? Give me an example of the motor cortex changing its mind about a reflex.
A classic paradigm by John Kalaska and others illustrates this beautifully. You train a monkey to hold its arm completely still in a central position. Then, you use a robotic manipulandum to suddenly apply a torque, physically bumping the monkey's hand to the right.
So you force an error.
The goal is to stay still, so the bump is an error. As expected, you see a massive spike of activity in M1 via that transcortical loop, instantly firing the leftward muscles to rapidly counteract the bump and return the arm to the center. The reflex actively fights the perturbation.
It aggressively defends the spatial coordinate.
But then, you change the rule. You give the monkey a different visual cue that means relax, just let your arm move freely. If it gets bumped, just let it go. Do not fight back.
Okay.
You then apply the exact same mechanical perturbation. The robotic arm bumps the monkey's hand to the right with the exact same force. The exact same sensory stretch signal travels up the arm to the brain.
But because the internal rule changed, M1 reacts differently.
The M1 corrective response is instantly dramatically suppressed. The neuron barely fires. The muscle doesn't contract. Because the overarching goal set by the premotor and parietal areas has changed from resist to yield, the higher cognitive areas dynamically dial down the gain on the M1 reflex loop.
That is the essence of optimal feedback control theory. The brain doesn't care about absolute kinematic perfection just for the sake of it. It cares about accomplishing the behavioral goal with the absolute minimum amount of necessary effort. If the bump doesn't threaten the success of the current goal, the brain simply ignores the error to save metabolic energy. It's profoundly elegant.
It is elegant for immediate physical bumps. But what if the error isn't a one-time mechanical nudge? What if the physical rules of the environment fundamentally, persistently change? How does the cortex adapt to a new reality?
Right.
This brings us to the profound concept of neuroplasticity and motor learning.
Because M1 is not just a static silicon processing chip running fixed code. It is biological tissue. The map itself changes structurally based on experience.
Profoundly so. The somatotopic horseshoe map we discussed earlier is not hardwired at birth and frozen for life. It is a highly fluid, fiercely competitive, adaptable landscape. We can see this plasticity happening in real time during motor adaptation tasks, like visuomotor rotations.
I love these experiments because they are basically perfectly designed video games to frustrate the brain. Walk us through a visuomotor rotation.
You have a subject, human or monkey, using a joystick to move a cursor on a computer screen. They start with normal physics, push the joystick straight up, the cursor moves straight up toward the target.
Simple enough.
They perform this thousands of times. M1 has built a highly reliable internal model, linking the population vector straight ahead to the visual result straight ahead.
And then, without telling the subject, the researchers rewrite the physics engine.
We reprogram the computer. Now, when the subject pushes the joystick straight up, the computer applies a 45-degree rotation. The cursor shoots off at a 45-degree angle to the right.
It completely shatters the internal model. The brain issues the command for straight, the arm moves straight, but the eyes report back, error, we went right. It generates a massive sensory prediction error.
At first, performance absolutely plummets. The subjects miss the targets wildly. But the brain is an adaptation machine. Over the course of dozens or hundreds of trials, they undergo sensorimotor adaptation. They implicitly learn that to make the cursor go straight up to the target, they must physically push the joystick 45 degrees to the left.
But what is the underlying mechanism of that learning? Are they just consciously thinking, okay, push left, or is the motor cortex fundamentally changing how it calculates the math?
If you record from M1 neurons during this adaptation, you literally watch the population vectors realign. Yes, the preferred directions of the individual neurons actually shift to accommodate the new visual reality. The neuron that previously fired maximally for straight ahead might shift its tuning curve so it now fires maximally when the arm moves 45 degrees left. The brain literally rewires its internal representation of physics to solve the persistent error.
It rewrites the software on the fly. But the plasticity goes even deeper than temporary software tweaks, doesn't it? If you learn a highly difficult, complex new motor skill over a long period of time, you don't just change the tuning curves, you actually change the physical macroarchitecture of the brain map.
Yes, and this was beautifully, definitively demonstrated by Randolph Nudo and his colleagues in the 1990s. They worked with squirrel monkeys, mapping their M1 cortex using precise microstimulation. They outlined exactly how many square millimeters of cortical territory were dedicated to the fingers, the wrist, and the forearm. They established the baseline real estate borders.
Finding the exact property lines of the homunculus.
Then, they subjected the monkeys to a grueling, intense motor training regimen. They hid tiny, delicious food pellets inside highly constrained, deep, narrow wells. To retrieve the food, the monkeys couldn't just use their normal sweeping hand grasp. They had to learn to carefully insert their fingers and use highly specific, fractionated, independent finger flexions to pry the pellet out.
That sounds tough.
It was a task demanding maximum distal dexterity, utilizing those direct CM cell pathways we discussed earlier.
So they practiced this intense, fine motor skill for hundreds of trials over several weeks. What happens to the physical real estate in the brain?
After the training period, Nudo opened up the skull and meticulously remapped the exact same area of M1. The map had radically changed. The cortical territory dedicated to those specific distal finger movements had physically expanded. The representations of the fingers had literally encroached upon and taken over adjacent territory that previously controlled the proximal arm or wrist.
It is the literal real estate market of the cortex. The neurons that fire together, wire together. The muscles used the most for highly complex, demanding tasks actively buy up more property in the M1 cortex. The brain allocates its hardware based on behavioral demand. Use it, and the territory expands. Stop using it, and that territory will be invaded and repurposed by other muscles.
The homunculus map is not a static drawing. It is a living, breathing, constantly shifting record of your physical interaction with the world. Your brain map right now looks different than it did 10 years ago, and it reflects the skills you have acquired.
That is just awe-inspiring. I want to take a breath and slowly retrace the massive, multi-layer journey we have just taken, because there are so many moving parts, so many billions of neurons involved in this simple act of driving your car or reaching for a glass of water.
It's a lot to take in.
We started the journey deep in the medial wall of the frontal lobe, in the supplementary motor area. This is the birthplace of the internal intention. This is where the readiness potential slowly builds a full second before action, challenging our notions of conscious free will, where sweeping overarching sequences are grammar checked, and where inappropriate environmental triggers are brutally suppressed to keep us acting within social norms.
Correct. From that internal command center, the signal moves outward to the lateral premotor cortex, the PMD and PMV, where the tactical negotiations happen. Here, external sensory information is integrated. Arbitrary rules like red means stop are mapped to specific physical actions. The hand is meticulously shaped to match the geometric affordances of the target object, and mirror neurons run covert simulations of the people around us to decode their intentions.
Then, that incredibly dense, complex, tactical blueprint is handed down to the primary motor cortex, M1. This isn't a neat piano keyboard, it is a highly interconnected, overlapping horseshoe map of functional motor synergies. Here, specialized corticomotor cells provide a direct private line to our fingertips, granting humans unparalleled tool use dexterity.
M1 then performs the ultimate translation. It takes the spatial kinematic plan and converts it into raw kinetic physics, calculating the precise forces required. It utilizes a vast, noisy democracy of broadly tuned neurons, aggregating their votes to generate a mathematically flawless population vector.
And finally, as that electrical command cascades down the spinal cord to the muscles, M1 stays actively engaged. It listens to ultra-fast 50-millisecond transcortical feedback loops, dynamically adjusting the gain based on behavioral goals to correct for real-world perturbations. And through it all, the tissue itself remains plastic, constantly shifting its tuning curves and expanding its physical territories to master new skills and adapt to altered physics. It is, without exaggeration, the most sophisticated control system in the known universe.
It is the biological foundation of how human consciousness imposes its will upon the physical universe.
As we wrap up this leg of the journey, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final mind-bending thought to mull over as you finish your drive. Everything we have unpacked today, understanding the abstraction of the premotor cortex, the direct wiring of the CM cells, and most importantly, the mathematical decoding of the population vector by Georgopoulos. This isn't just theoretical textbook neuroscience. This knowledge has spawned one of the most miraculous science fiction-turned-reality medical technologies of our time, brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs.
The ultimate application of motor neuroscience. Because scientists proved that M1 encodes movement intent via population vectors before the movement happens, they realized that if they could listen to the neurons, they could read the mind's intent.
Literally read the intent. Today, neurosurgeons can take a patient who is completely locked in, completely paralyzed from the neck down due to a severe spinal cord injury, or ALS. Their spinal cord is severed, the signal cannot reach the muscles, but their frontal lobe, their SMA, their PMD, their M1, that hardware is still perfectly intact and healthy. The surgeons implant a tiny silicon square called a Utah array containing 100 microscopic electrodes directly into the arm area of the patient's primary motor cortex.
So when the paralyzed patient simply imagines or intends to reach for a cup of coffee, their M1 neurons fire exactly as we've described. They generate the precise population vector for a 3D reach, even though their physical arm cannot move.
And the computer chip wired to their skull reads those firing rates in real time. It runs the exact same vector addition math that Georgopoulos discovered in the 1980s, translates that biological population vector into digital machine code, and uses it to drive a robotic arm mounted to the patient's wheelchair. By simply generating the thought, the internal intention, a paralyzed individual can reach out with a robotic limb, grab a cup of coffee, and bring it to their lips.
It is the ultimate proof that the rules of movement we've explored today, the transition from abstract intent to vector math, are universally real.
Yeah.
They are so fundamentally sound that they can be extracted from the brain and used to literally transcend the limitations of the biological human body.
Just let that marinate for the rest of your drive. We hope you've enjoyed this unhurried, meticulously detailed exploration of the motor system. We will be back to continue our deep dive series next time, venturing even further into neural networks, the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, to see how the brain refines and perfects our movement. Safe travels and keep wondering.